of the, okay, got it. It gets lost on a daily basis because drug trafficking and illegal immigration are so common, so prevalent, so overwhelming that trying to sort it all out at the ground level is next to impossible. I think, let me go to my slides. I think I can get this right. Oh, wait a minute. Can everybody see the slide?
Not yet, no.
All right, wait a minute. I got to get back to. I think I did this in the wrong order. All right. Share screen. All right.
Okay, we got it. Great.
Got it? Okay, yeah. And so I've used this, I've updated this for maybe the last 15 or 20 years. And I used to call it immigration by the numbers. I modified it to add the word perpetual. And I start off, I mean, this is a talk about border security, but border security basically is shrouded in immigration issues. It is by far on a daily basis, the part of border security that dominates the effort of the border security agencies, and everything gets mixed up with immigration to one degree or another. So when we talk about border security, the threats generally are top priority is terrorists, drug trafficking, which has been a huge problem for the last 50 years or more, illegal immigration, which has been a big problem since 1965. I'll explain that a little bit later. And part of the illegal immigration story is human trafficking and asylum fraud, which is very much in the news these days. And then I put customs and import violations because when many decades ago, maybe centuries ago, when we started border enforcement activities, it was almost all related to customs and import-export issues. We did not have an immigration policy until the late 1800s. So immigration, there was lots of immigration, but there was no enforcement part of it until well into the 19th century. But still, it is the responsibility of what used to be the Customs Service, now the Customs and Border Protection, to make sure that everything coming in to the country comes in legally, that everything that comes in legally, that if there are customs duties appropriate, they have to be collected. And so if we did not have all these other issues to deal with, customs and import violations would be something much more prominent. But again, it gets buried. I remember back in the 90s when I was working at the Treasury Department, I visited the customs facility in Long Beach, which is the Long Beach, Los Angeles harbor is probably the busiest in the world, or in the country anyway. And it was I was visiting the inspector facility, and I saw a customs inspector who was taking computers apart to make sure that all of the component parts were what's the word, legitimate, that they weren't they weren't fakes, they hadn't been copied, that all the trademarks and copyright violations had been obeyed and followed. It just seems like an impossible task to make sure that all of these rules are followed. We know they are not, but trying to catch them is next to impossible. But as I started to say, the whole issue of border security, I think, starts, I say, let's look at the haystack, which is immigration. And it's the haystack, it's because there were so many people crossing the border on a daily basis that the terrorists, drug traffickers, and customs violations or violators sort of hide amongst the flow of immigrants, both legal and illegal. So some recent news, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but as of July 21, we've had 5 straight months of over 170,000 people arrested at the border. The number in June was the highest in over 20 years. April 20 to April 21 showed a 900% increase in illegal immigration. Mixed in among these, or maybe part of the whole thing, is not just what we used to think of as people trying to come to this country to find work. We have now a massive refugee flow, mostly from Central America, but not exclusively. The Customs and Border Protection regularly apprehends 70 to 80 nationalities of people coming from all over the world. Certainly the numbers of the non-Central Americans is much smaller, but nevertheless, it's a huge, ongoing, increasingly difficult problem to deal with. During the Trump administration, because of the flow, he adopted or put in place what was called the Remain in Mexico policy, which was the opposite of what had been in place before that, which was catch and release. And I'll start with catch and release, which basically meant that there were so many people coming across the border and getting caught that the Border Patrol was unable to process them all on the spot. So they would collect a minimal amount of information and then release these people into the United States, giving them a notice to appear at some future court date with an immigration judge. And so we began to see people who were not trying to avoid being arrested when they came across the border. They would come across and turn themselves in because they knew they would just be processed and released into the United States, where they would disappear into the underground, and most of whom would never show up at their future court appearances with the immigration judge. So the Remain in Mexico policy was designed to stem that flow, and it worked quite well for a number of years during the Trump administration. That has been changed, and although the present administration keeps going back and forth about whether they're going to retain it, for a while they initially said they were not going to maintain the Remain in Mexico policy, and when that invited untold thousands of people to decide this was a good time to try to come to the country, they've sort of put it back in place, but they're trying to figure out now what to do in the long run. I mentioned Title 42 because that's a provision, that's a health and welfare provision, which allows the United States to exclude people on health reasons. So you can imagine with the pandemic we've been experiencing for the last, year and a half, almost 2 years now, anybody that comes across the border, there's no way to test them. We have no idea who's carrying what diseases when they come across the border. So another policy that was put in place during Trump, which has been maintained at least temporarily by the Biden administration, is to exclude people, is to use Title 42 to deny people entry, although that doesn't apply across the board to everybody. When I say immigration is perpetual, it's because of population growth, world population growth. And I guess I'll add at this point that the United States is certainly not the only country in the world that is experiencing this immigration flow from the third world. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar, you read the paper, you see it on the news about the experiences in Europe for the last 6 or 7 years with hundreds of thousands of people from the Middle East and from Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa that are paying smugglers to float them across the Mediterranean to try to get into the European Union. I won't talk about that in any greater detail other than just to acknowledge that all of the first world countries are the goal of many people in the third world who want to come and live a better life. I mean, we understand that, but we are not alone. I think the United States, because of our proximity to Mexico and Central America, saw this earlier than the European countries, but now we're all in the same boat. The point here is that the world population is growing, continues to grow. About 2/3 of the growth in the world population is in third world countries, which are almost by definition the poorest, least attractive places to live. And so the pressure from the downtrodden increases as the population increases. So this is not something that you can just, I don't care who the president is or what Congress decides to do today, immigration will be an issue for the first world, probably for the next century, until somebody figures out how to deal with the third world and make the third world countries better, to reduce the reasons for people to leave the third world. So the world population increases by about 80 million per year. I put in today's, the population of the world today, you'll see October 13th is almost 7.8 billion. When the Census Bureau some years ago was predicting when we would hit 7 billion, their estimate was that we would reach 7 billion in 2013. We actually got there in 2011. And as you can see, they estimated that we would get to 8 billion in 2028. I think we're going to probably get there sooner because the world population just keeps increasing. So that drives immigration worldwide. It's not something that can be resolved just by dealing with Mexico or even just Central America. It's an ongoing problem for as far as we can see, for as far ahead as we can see. United States, this is the population growth in the United States. When the Constitution was adopted, the population of the country was 3.9 million. You can see there how we have grown. 1900, 121 years ago, we were only at 76 million people, but you'll see how the numbers have increased so dramatically. And at the bottom, 1 birth every 8 seconds, 1 death every 13 seconds, 1 net immigrant every 33 seconds. So every 12 seconds, we're adding 1 more person to the population of the United States. This gets to the point of how big do we want, or do we care, or can we control population growth given finite resources, clean air, clean water, housing, food, etc. It's often said that the solution to illegal immigration is just to increase legal immigration. Well, we do pretty well on the legal immigration front. We always have. We admit more people legally every year than the rest of the world combined. But this again gives you by decade the number of people that immigrated legally to the United States. You can see that after the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, the numbers went up quite dramatically, quite quickly. Among the factors that began that trend and which continue to this day is technology. I mean, the ability to get on a steamship as opposed to a sailing vessel, the ability to phone home, send telegrams, mail, to communicate worldwide has encouraged and led to and added to the ability of people worldwide to travel, to get to wherever they want to be. And look, at the United States is destination number one for almost all people seeking a better life. I've underlined the 1901, 1910 decade, because that was for a long time the height of the legal immigration flow to the United States. We still, in 1882, the United States passed its first immigration laws. And the only people, the law was quite limited. It basically said that anybody could come to the United States unless they were criminals, mental defectives, or had some dread disease. So it was not much of a restriction, and there were no numerical restrictions on immigration. Just to continue through the decades, you'll see that from the decade of 1921 on, the number from 21 to 31, the number dropped dramatically. And that was because in 1924, Congress for the first time passed a numerical limitation on immigration. This was the so-called quota system, which drastically reduced legal immigration. The forces that pushed for restrictions were the labor unions, because they viewed the massive flow of new immigrants as negatively affecting their ability to form unions and gain leverage in the workplace. Employers loved unlimited immigration because they gave them a never-ending flow of cheap, available, amenable workers. And so the unions, the churches, and what was then called the progressive movement, which I think is a little different from what we call the progressive movement today, the progressives were the ones that pushed the immigration law through Congress in 1924. So immigration was limited until the mid-1960s. Well, it continued, that law continued until 1965, when Congress passed a new law, which is still the basic immigration law that we have today. And it replaced the quota system with a system that emphasized family reunification, labor, and refugees as the component parts of who could come legally. That caused a huge surge in legal immigration, and continues to this day. Now you see, when we got to 2001, 2010 decade, we surpassed, well, the decade before also surpassed the previous high of legal immigrants. The numbers at the end, I'll show you. There's a statistical report that DHS puts out every year. It's always 2 years behind, so the latest numbers end in 2019. typical government that they can't get this thing done on any kind of timely basis. But nevertheless, we'll clearly exceed the 10 billion for the decade once we add the 2020 figures. And at least from my perspective, the difference was in the post-Civil War industrial, late 1800s, early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution, the United States actually thought it was in the best interest, the national interest, to increase the population. We wanted more workers. We actually had programs where we sent people to Europe to encourage people to immigrate legally to the United States. And, we built the Transcontinental Railroad, the Industrial Revolution took place. I mean, there was plenty of work for plenty of people. And at least in my mind, those conditions don't exist anymore, but we are still importing legally more people now than we did at that point in the late 1800s, early 1900s. All of these legal immigrants are processed. I mean, they make an application. They have to fall into a certain category. That are enumerated. The categories are enumerated in the law. They're either a family member and depending on how close a family member you are, there's different categories for family, for fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers, etc. Or you can apply for one of a whole bunch of different labor categories that exist, where we want to import people with certain talents, certain characteristics to help, which we think is in the national interest. I mean, that's the way the law was designed. And we also import or admit it varies every year, but a number of refugees, and we can talk about that a little bit as well. Green cards, that's the document for someone who's admitted as a legal immigrant. I mean, you can look, again, these numbers are all available in the statistical report and they go back to the dark ages, but just to show you the more recent trends, the number of green cards issued and the percentage of those that went to people from Mexico. Since, Mexico is their nearest neighbor to the south, it's logical that we would have more immigration from Mexico than probably anywhere else in the world. And you'll see here the percentages of the green cards that have been issued to Mexican citizens. This is going down. Let me go back to the previous chart for a minute. Let's see, so back in the 1990s, 18, 20, 23, 19, 20%, we've now gone down to the 14, 15% because more of the green cards are going to people from countries other than Mexico. Legal alien arrests, again, the numbers are available that go way back before this. But for those of us who have lived in San Diego for many years, and again, when I started as an assistant U.S. attorney in 1972, and throughout the 16 years I was a federal prosecutor, immigration violations were by far the largest category of crimes that we prosecuted. And it was clear that every year, more than 1 million people would be arrested along the US-Mexican border. And for most of the years from the 70s on, at least half of those, or close to half of them, occurred just in the San Diego Border Patrol sector, which runs basically from the Pacific Ocean to the mountains, 60 miles east. Why? Well, we're all familiar with the border. There's essentially, before there were no fences, there were no physical deterrents. for most of that time, not until the late early 1990s when they started building fences. So if you could get to Mexico, if you were a Mexican or a non-Mexican and you could get to Mexico, you could get across the border easily. You just walked across. And there were so many people doing it that the Border Patrol might catch, 10 people, 50 people, but the other 200 got by. So the San Diego sector was the busiest Border Patrol sector in the country up until the Clinton administration, when, and I think you're going to hear from Alan Burson in the near future, who was the U.S. attorney during the Clinton years. I've never gotten him to admit this to me, but I'm absolutely sure that he was instrumental in convincing the Clinton administration that something drastic had to take place on the border. And so we began to see lights, fences, sensors, an increase in Border Patrol agents put in place. They had a new strategy, which they unveiled in the 1994-1995 period. And you'll see the numbers started to go down in San Diego dramatically as a result of the Clinton administration's enforcement policies. The problem was those immigrants that used to try to cross in the San Diego area just moved east. And so you'll see that the total number of arrests along the rest of the Mexican border went up. The strategy was, it seemed to make sense at the time. The strategy was, if we can close the border in the areas where it's the easiest to cross, Tijuana, the San Diego sector, the area around El Paso. If we could close off those easy ways to get into the US, no one would be stupid enough to try to cross the Sonoran Desert in the middle of July in Arizona. Well, that proved to be wrong. I mean, desperate people would do anything, undertake any risk to get into the United States because the incentives to get here, I mean, the reason to get here was still, the pull factors still existed. If they could survive, they would get a job and their life would be much better than wherever they came from. So the incentives did not decrease. The difficulty increased, but not enough to limit or reduce the number of people willing to take the chance. So again, you'll see the numbers here went way, way down. At some point, I started to capture the number of the total number of people arrested, how many of them were from Mexico. And in those days, it was predominantly a Mexican immigration problem. But as we've gone forward, we'll see that the Mexican part of the flow has been reduced dramatically, quite dramatically. So let's see, let me go back here for a minute. Where did I put that? Yeah. So we went down to the low. I think the low was 100,000 in 2002. And look at 2001, 9/11 occurs. There was a dramatic, well, there was a new awareness of the threat of terrorism. And so all border security agencies and resources and policies and procedures were enhanced to deal with the next terrorist. And the theory was that while the 19 terrorists on 9/11 all had come in legally on visas, tourist visas or student visas, if we could close off that avenue for people to come in by fault, by gaining a document through fraud, if they still wanted to get here, the most obvious place was to try to come in across the border. And if an uneducated peasant from El Salvador could make it from El Salvador to Chicago, then certainly a dedicated terrorist could do the same thing. So the threat of terrorists coming across the border we became much more aware of that possibility. I will show you later a recent book that's been written about the attempt to deal with these what's called special interest aliens. These are aliens from the countries you can probably name, figure out the countries we're most concerned about. So anyway, the numbers, we get back to manageable numbers, both totally and in San Diego, although the percentage of people from Mexico declines pretty dramatically. Most of the balance are now Central Americans with other, what the Border Patrol refers to as third country nationals, could be from anywhere: China, India, Africa, the Middle East, you name it. This just brings the numbers up to date. This is, you'll see again, fairly dramatic reduction in arrests in San Diego from over 500,000 a year to 26,000 is just remarkable that we were able to accomplish that. You know, the law says that if somebody comes into the country illegally, and or if someone comes in legally on a temporary visa, a student visa, tourist visa, any kind of a temporary visa, and they overstay that visa, they become illegal. And the Congress passed the law many, many years ago, basically said that it's the responsibility of what was then the Immigration Service, now the Department of Homeland Security, to locate, arrest, and deport, or locate, arrest, and remove people that are here illegally. Now, there's 3 columns here. It's a little bit confusing, but if you start with 1987, look at all of these years here where this is in the midst of where we had more than 1 million people every year coming in illegally. And the government was only willing, and I use that word advisedly, willing to do a minimal amount of interior enforcement. And so the numbers of people that were removed, arrested and removed, is shameful. It's embarrassing that out of the millions of people, 11, 12, 13 million, nobody really knows for sure, people that are here illegally, that so few people, that the government makes very little effort to enforce the law. Beginning in the end of the Clinton administration, and again, this was interesting. Clinton, there was an attempt, there have been numerous attempts over the years to reform the immigration law. And all of the proposals include a concept that some of us refer to as amnesty, which means that if certain people that are here illegally, if you've been here a certain amount of time and you haven't committed any crimes, we're going to let you stay. We're going to give you amnesty and let you stay legally. That concept began in 1986 when Congress passed the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Law. It failed miserably, obviously. But the idea was, at that point, we'll grant amnesty to the people that are here illegally in return for better enforcement so we don't ever have to do this again. Well, here we are again. So in order to make it, the argument that was being made against these reform measures was, look, you're not enforcing the current law. So how do we, so why grant amnesty, which will just encourage more people to come? Because they'll, they're not stupid. They saw what we did in '86. You're going to do it again. And so that just becomes another magnet, another attraction to people who say, well, I better get there now. And sooner or later, they'll give me amnesty. So in order to counter that argument, the Clinton administration began to beef up their interior enforcement effort to try to demonstrate that they were serious about enforcing the law. So you'll see some pretty significant numbers when you compare it to everything prior to 1996. And that continued through most of this decade. So we've done better. But there's continued political opposition to the idea that the government should arrest and deport people who've been here for who knows how long. So that's the crux of the ongoing debate about immigration reform, is what do you do about the people that have been here a long time, and what do you do to make sure that we don't have to do this again in another 10 or 15 or 20 years. I'm going to sort of skip over this. This is a little esoteric, but there's a difference between people. Removals means people being arrested in the interior of the United States and deported or voluntarily leaving. Returns used to mean people that were actually arrested at the border and on the same day or the next day would be voluntarily returned to Mexico. And that used to be the normal process. Now it was, I mean, again, this goes back to the late 1960s. The problem with the return problem was we didn't have enough capacity to prosecute. I mean, there were too many people to prosecute. We didn't have the detention space to hold them. So the only option was just to get them to go back to Mexico. And so it was not unusual for the Border Patrol to arrest the same guy 3 times in 2 days. I mean, we'd send them back to Tijuana, they'd try again, they'd be caught again, they send them back again, and sooner or later they would make it. But you'll see that the number of removals and returns changed over the course of time. And the return part of it is partly due to the fact that less people were getting caught at the border, which is good. That's the good news. I'm going to skip this one because it's a little out of date. This is out of date, but it does show you sort of the ratio for some years of interior and criminal interior deportations. Criminal deportations, total deportations. Criminal deportations means that somebody has come to the United States and while they were here, they committed a crime that makes them deportable. The blue line, total deportations, means those people who are just here illegally and are being sent back because somebody caught them. Again, I'm going to skip that. It's out of date. So it's just back to my original theme. Immigration is not static. We don't know what we don't know. We know who we catch, but we don't know who we don't catch. And people have argued and estimated for years trying to figure out, well, how many people got away? Nobody knows. I mean, there's no way of knowing that. So an unknown number, and every day. I mean, this is not something that happened last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. I mean, today, tomorrow, the next day, next week, next month, this is going on every single day. And we do nothing about it, or we do very little about it. When you take those numbers of people that are admitted legally, it ends up, it averages out to about 2,740 people every day of the year are being admitted legally. This is a little bit out of order, but when I became an assistant U.S. attorney in 1972, there were 2,200 Border Patrol agents in the entire United States. And their responsibility was the 2,000-mile border with Mexico, the 4,000-mile border between Canada and the United States, not counting Alaska, and the coastline. So you can see that that was a token effort to say the least. By 1992, it had increased about almost doubled, a little less than doubled. After 9/11, it doubled again. And then from the next few years, it went up, down, and this is about the number we have today, 1,900, 19,000, give or take. And again, when you figure this, you're still talking about a 2,000-mile Mexican border, 4,000 miles of Canadian border, thousands of miles of coastline. And you're talking about 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So when you divide up the agents into 8-hour shifts, and then you add in vacation time and training time, there's not a whole lot of people at any given moment on the border providing security. I mentioned before the types of legal documents, legal admissions that the current law provides. And we'll just use these years as examples. The total number of green cards issued in 2011, family-sponsored, immediate relatives, employment-based, diversity, that's a separate category, refugees, and asylum claims. So almost 700,000 of the 1 million came in because they were related to somebody that was here in the United States already. It didn't matter anything, nothing else mattered. Doesn't matter if they could speak what languages they could speak. It didn't matter what job skills they had. It didn't matter what education level they had. The only sole criteria was that they were related to somebody that was already here. So that's what we call family reunification. Of the total 140,000 roughly people who we grant permission to come to work because we want that particular, whatever skill set they have, whatever training, whatever education they have. Now, other countries, lots of other countries don't have this kind of law. They have a point system which takes into account family relationships. It takes in skills, takes in education, takes in language, takes in a number of different factors to determine who gets to come legally. At least from my perspective, the family sponsorship and the family reunification criteria is outdated, and it's not in the national interest. We're letting people in just because they're related to somebody, and not because we need their skills, their education, or whatever. Again, just updated some of the more recent. And I think this is probably still true that the family categories make up 65% of all legal immigrants. Now look at the country we have. This is a matter of choice. There is nothing in the Constitution which dictates what our immigration policy should be. Congress could decide that the only people that they wanted to come into the country are left-handed Norwegian, red-headed Norwegians, and that would be legal. So they can decide, Congress can decide on who is eligible to come in. They can choose anything they want. And so we'll get to this in a little bit about other proposals or other ways to manage our legal immigration system. Now, this is important for a different reason. In addition to all of the immigrant categories, legal immigrants, there is a whole different world of non-immigrant admissions. Now, these are people who come as students, tourists, agricultural workers. These are temporary visas. When we issue somebody a green card, it's presumably forever. When you get a green card and you're a permanent legal resident, you're here forever, assuming you don't commit a deportable offense, and you're eligible to apply for citizenship in a certain period of time. But in addition to all of those, we have all of these non-immigrant admissions that take place. And the reason I put this down is, let's take that 2018, 181 million people were granted some kind of non-immigrant admission. What that means is, I put this up here for workflow purposes. Somebody in the government, one or more people in the government, had to process 181 million applications for some kind of a visa. So the workflow, the workload on the people in Citizenship and Immigration Services and the other component parts of the DHS, they're overwhelmed. They are overwhelmed. And so is it possible that of these 181 million people applying for one of these categories, are some of them lying? Yeah, absolutely. Is there some good way to vet all of these people? No. Now, if you're coming from a first world country, there's a pretty good chance that the American consulate in Paris or London or Berlin is going to be able to do a pretty good job of vetting the people that are applying for these kinds of visas. And so that doesn't seem to be a major problem other than the workload issue. But when you're coming from a non-first world country, and this would include refugees, which are not included on this chart, but it's the same problem. When someone from a third world country is applying for a non-immigrant visa, or they're applying for asylum or for refugee status, our ability to vet those people to make sure they're not terrorists, criminals, that they don't have communicable diseases, et cetera, is limited. I mean, who are you going to ask in Afghanistan to check out somebody's background? I mean, it's just not doable. It's not possible. And there's lots and lots of countries around the world where we have little, if any, chance to properly vet people applying for non-immigrant admissions, visas, or applying for refugee status. Let's see, again, just to give you, I'm going to sort of skip over this for a minute, I think, and get to the, hopefully, the bottom line. Why are we doing this? In developing a national immigration policy, you have to ask why. What are we trying to accomplish? And who are we trying to benefit? And how many people are we trying to benefit? And what is the impact of those decisions? So the why question: identify the national interest to be promoted. What is the objective we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to increase the labor supply? Are we trying to protect wages, benefits, and the working conditions of those people that are already here legally, citizens or people that are here legally? Is family reunification? I mean, it's certainly a presentable reason. Is that what we're trying to achieve? Do we have humanitarian concerns? Is that what our objective is to provide humanitarian relief to people around the world? There may be other factors that you would consider as objectives, but those, I guess, give you some idea of what we're trying to do. I don't think our current policy answers any of these questions. I don't think that Congress, I don't think any Congress or any president in the last 50 years has thought about any of this. So once you identify the national policy, identify the characteristics of potential immigrants who fulfill the policy goals you've identified. You want high-skilled workers? Fine. You want low-skilled workers? Fine. You want family members? Is that the goal? Is that the who question? You want refugees? And then how many? How many immigrants who satisfy their criteria established by the who question should be admitted? You know, you may decide you want to bring in people with physics degrees. Well, how many? You may want to bring in farm workers. Well, how many? You may want to bring in nurses. How many? It's, you know, once you decide on what you want to do, you still have to answer the number question. And then what impact will that immigration policy have on society? What's the effect on the labor supply? What's the effect on wages, benefits, and working conditions? What's the effect on population growth? What are the environmental factors that should be taken into consideration? What effect on culture? If that's a legitimate question. Again, my view of what's happened during our lifetime, my lifetime for sure, is that Congress has never diligently dealt with these issues on any kind of rational basis. It's all been politics as usual. So my view of the solutions. Mandatory e-verify. E-verify is a system of verifying work that you're authorized to work in the United States. This idea came up in the 1990s during the Clinton administration, and actually it started in the Reagan administration with the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. The idea was most people coming here, legally or illegally, are coming to find work. I mean, there's exceptions, but that's the overwhelming motivation for most people to come here, is to find work and live a better life. Well, if you're not authorized to work here, you could spread that message, fewer people would come. You turn off the jobs magnet. Well, the 1986 law created this stupid form, the I-9. Many of you probably have had to fill out an I-9 at some point, or had, and that's this sort of a self-certifying system that you are here to work. I mean, it's riddled with fraud. It's never worked. So by 1996, Congress decided, hey, this isn't working. We need to look for a better way. So they came up with a computerized system where you would check, the employer would verify Social Security, date of birth, and name with the Social Security Administration when someone applied for a job. It was known as something else at the time. It's been called E-Verify for a number of years now. Some of you may use this. I mean, you can go online now and you can check E-Verify, see how it works. There are too many special interests who don't want immigration to work, immigration policy to work. And so Congress has, and every president since 1996 has refused to require all employers to use E-Verify. So the jobs magnet continues. The magnet continues to draw people here. On top of that, we don't do much workplace enforcement to find out the employers who are hiring illegal aliens, which is a crime. And so we change nothing. Now, there are some sectors of the economy where E-Verify is mandatory. If you're a government contractor, you have to use E-Verify. There are certain security related industries that you have to use E-Verify. If you're an employer and you've been caught violating the law, you're required to use E-Verify in the future. But Congress, tomorrow, they could do this. They could fix this system tomorrow, but no one wants to, because both parties are, what's the word? Supported by various special interests that like the situation as it is, which means it's not working. If you wanted to turn off the motivation for people to come here legally, you need to do interior enforcement. You cannot let people think that if they get past the Border Patrol and they can make it to Chicago or Des Moines, Iowa, or Trenton, New Jersey, that you're home free. But that's the way it is. And that's the way it's been since the late 1960s for the most part. With no interior, and to make matters worse, you have various state and local governments that are interfering with the ability of the federal government to enforce the immigration law, the so-called sanctuary cities and things of that nature. Certainly, you need improvements in border security. And again, for those of us that live in San Diego, we saw the dramatic difference along the 16 miles from the ocean to the Otay Mountains when they built the fences and put the lights and cameras up. So border security, fences, lights, cameras, additional Border Patrol agents, detention space, that all works, but it's not the best solution. The best solution is E-Verify. You have to turn off the magnets and everything else that encourages people to come here illegally. There's been a lot in the news lately about how the asylum process is such a mess. There's so many loopholes in it that basically people, again, they come across the border, they turn themselves into the Border Patrol. They don't even try to avoid being caught, and they've been taught how to claim asylum or ask for asylum, which requires that they be processed, which means they get released and given a court date for a future hearing, which most don't show up to. We should restructure the legal immigration system to reduce or eliminate the family chain migration and move to a system like Canada has. Actually, Mexico's immigration law is much better than ours as well. And we need to question how many people we want to come in regardless of what system we use. This isn't the Industrial Revolution. We aren't building transcontinental railroads. The need for cheap, unskilled labor is significantly less than it was 100 years ago. So why do we need to bring in over 1 million people a year legally? Immigration is not the solution to every tragedy, disaster, and misfortune that occurs anywhere in the world. It just drives me crazy. And it will be an issue as long as there's a first world and a third world. People have suggested, well, the solution is we need to fix the third world. Okay, fine. How long is that going to take? And what do we do in the meantime? And who's going to pay for it? Back in the 90s, Bill Clinton, actually George Bush the first, 41, had appointed a presidential commission to look at immigration reform just before he left office, and Bill Clinton inherited it. It's sometimes referred to as the Barbara Jordan Commission. Barbara was a congresswoman from, I think, Houston, somewhere in Texas, and she was the chairwoman until she passed away near the end of the commission's work. It is both a right and responsibility of a democratic society to manage immigration so that it serves the national interest. This is from a liberal Democrat from Texas. Just some things that you can refer to if you feel the urge. I think that may be the end. So, questions?
Peter, I have a question. I'll start things off. When legal immigrants come, do they have to still have a sponsor? I know when my dad brought my mom's sister over, he had a sponsor. He was responsible for all her expenses until she got a job and a green card. So I'm just curious if that system still is in place.
It does. It is, in fact, in 1996, Congress, how do I describe it? They reinforced, they tried to make it tougher or more meaningful. And yeah, you're supposed to have a sponsor. The sponsor has to have a certain level of economic ability and is supposed to take care of any financial needs of the person they're sponsoring. It's been the law since the 1880s that if an immigrant, a legal immigrant, becomes a quote public charge, they are supposed to be deported. That's still the law. And so it's hard. I think there was at some point during the Trump administration where he talked about trying to remind people of the public charge doctrine, and the world went crazy. Everybody came out. He was ridiculed. He was it never got off the ground. But that is still the law. The law is if you become a public charge, you're supposed to be deported, and unless your sponsor resolves the financial problems, the financial issues.
Okay, Krista, you seem to have some thoughts on this subject. If you wouldn't mind asking Peter some of your pertinent questions there.
I don't know that I actually have questions. I have some thoughts on it, but I think that I probably should refrain simply because I work for USCIS and this is my field. So if I can't speak on behalf of my agency, but I was trying to provide some links and some definitions for those people who ask questions. So I just was on the public charge question. I mean, just keeping in mind that the idea behind it, the concept behind it, I did do training. So that's one of the reasons why I have some of this in hand is explaining to a lot of people, when you work for someplace like USCIS, when you work for someone when you work for USCIS, you end up, you have a lot of people who don't do immigration, they do all the support work. And so we created a lot of trainings within our agency so that those individuals can understand what we do on the production side. So anyway, one of the things we do talk about is the idea of public charge. And before I worked for USCIS, I worked for the Department of State and I adjudicated visas overseas in Mexico in particular. So the idea behind the sponsorship is that every person who comes in on an immigrant visa, the intent is family reunification, it's for employment based, it's for national interest. So the concept behind it, all immigration, is that it should be in the best interest of the United States, whether of an individual, US citizen, the US company, et cetera. Therefore, a petition is filed on behalf of the person who's coming to the United States. That petition is filed by that US person or organization. They have to say, hey, look, I'm bringing this non-citizen to the United States, and I'll be responsible for making sure that that person doesn't become a burden. And that's the idea and the concept behind the sponsorship, if you will. And so the question is that enforcement side. And it's one of those things that I've seen kind of from both sides of the bulletproof glass, so to speak, the challenge of that enforcement. I know overseas when I would see these forms filled out and people would have a neighbor fill it out. They're like, I don't have the money, but, and this neighbor's like, I'm not going to support this person for the next 10 years. But people knew that there was no enforcement of that, that sponsorship. So those who were legitimate, so I saw this when I worked at Texas A&M, I worked with a lot of students and, they would get married and those kids would be freaking out because they're like, oh my gosh, my parents have to sponsor my spouse for the rest of their life. And so they're really serious about it, but then the ones who are gaming the system are going to game the system. And so it's one of those things where there's kind of two sides to that same coin. So I did want to mention that part because the intent is there. And I think there's a lot of unintended consequences of well-intended behaviors with immigration for sure.
Yeah, I came out of FBI retirement to go work in background checks and visas. And the backlog was 2 million.
Yes.
And we could only give them a cursory look unless something was really flat. So it's an ongoing problem. Peter's certainly has laid out a lot more of the problem.
Yeah. Well,
Just
we're really doing well with, I mean, the beauty of systems and everything is now everything that's said in an interview or said in an application or whatever can be validated and verified in systems. So that's one of those things that it used to be when I first started in immigration 20 years ago. That was one of those things where, you know, an applicant gave you a piece of paper and you had to interview them and really kind of do a lot of lie detection right there at the window. But now you can kind of do some verification stuff that we weren't able to do before.
Okay. We have a question from Tom. Tom, you want to go with that, or I'll read it?
My question, I can go with it if that's okay.
Yeah, go, please.
Okay, is that I understand from the reporting that currently when these masses of people cross, so when these masses of people cross, the Border Patrol agents have to respond to that mass of people, leaving much of the border unpatrolled. At that point, the cartels are sending in their Chinese origin or Chinese helped fentanyl, which is killing thousands of Americans. How do we solve the fentanyl problem? And was it the cartels last week that fired machine guns with tracers across the border to protect their areas of operation?
Well, I don't know the answer to the last question, Tom. But as I talked about a little bit, the number of Border Patrol agents actually on duty at any given time is finite. And it has always been a tactic to divert, flood the border, if you will, in various places. So knowing that the Border Patrol can only respond, to some degree, to a limited degree, and that opened the border, for whoever was next, whoever was waiting. So clearly that is a tactic that's been tried, has worked for decades. So the cartels apparently, and to go back to the broader issue of border security, the overwhelming nature of the immigration problem just makes it so much easier for the drug smugglers to do their work. And it also makes it easier for people who are on the commercial side. There's only so many inspectors that can look in so many 18-wheelers to see what's in there. So the problem is I think there's been minor improvements over the last couple of decades, but we're still overwhelmed.
Thank you.
Okay, and another question is, what is the percentage of illegal aliens that walk in illegally versus fly into the U.S. and stay illegally? You may have touched on that. I know the numbers are pretty high for overstayers.
Yeah, the overstayers, the estimate for years was 40% of the current illegal population are people who overstay their visa. Now, they came in legally, on some kind of a temporary visa, and they just never left. And to sort of point out again the absurdity or the incoherence of our policy, if you come in illegally, you've actually committed a misdemeanor offense. You can go to jail. I mean, it's rarely enforced, but it is a criminal offense. But if you overstay a visa, it's not a criminal offense. So you have two people who both got here by different means, who are both now illegal, and the overstayer can be deported but cannot be prosecuted, whereas the person who physically walked across the border or hid in somebody's trunk, they could be prosecuted. Back when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, every year annually we would get a letter from the Attorney General saying, hey, if you have any suggestions for proposed legislation, send it in. And I would send in every year 3 or 4 border-related things like this: overstays. Why are people who overstay the visa not subject to the same criminal penalty as someone who came across the Rio Grande? Nobody cared. Never got anywhere.
Another question is those who are in, say, the catch and release program, they're waiting for a court date sometime in the future. If a female has a baby here, does that baby now become an anchor baby? And now is the whole court process now moot?
No, it's not really. I mean, you're right that the that the child, having been born in the United States, is now a U.S. citizen. Birthright citizenship is referred to. There's been discussions for a number of years about whether that's a valid whether that's still a valid basis for citizenship. It will be until somebody contests it, but that would then give the parents at least another argument that they should be allowed to stay.
Ann Burke, you had an interesting question as well. If you want to go back and ask Peter that. There's be a drop off and by a similar reduction in temporary work visas. And I'll go ahead and read your question. Legal immigration is reportedly well down from pre-pandemic levels. Could this drop off combined with a similar reduction in temporary work visas and refugee admissions due to Chapter 42 have contributed to the current labor situation that has given workers much more choice of jobs than usual, but also has caused labor shortages in key sectors of the economy?
Hey, Mike, this is John Schlosser. I was using Ann's computer. And,
Hey, John, all right. Sorry.
And I guess my broader question is, these figures are, and I understand the reason for it, they're not necessarily reflective of current reality. The legal immigration numbers are way down, and I happen to know that the embassies overseas, where I used to work, have not been interviewing applicants and issuing visas. And I just would like to ask whether that factor, combined with the the slowdown and the for example, all the Jamaican farm employees that used to pick apples this time of year in New England, they're not coming because of health reasons. And whatever happens to the people who have crossed over that are Haitians and whatever, the actual refugee admissions are also way down. Is that having any kind of a cumulative impact on the current labor situation? It may be good that that's the case. Certainly, American workers have more freedom to move around in the labor force these days. Other people, including big employers, may think that it's not a good thing. But I just wonder if our speakers got some impressions of current reality during the pandemic.
Well, I don't know. I haven't, the numbers, hard to get the numbers of what's actually happening today recently, in the recent past. But I'll accept your suggestion for the sake of argument, at least.
I just want to interject that I read a newspaper report a few days ago that the number of legal immigrant visas issued in the third quarter of 2020 was down 60% from the same period the previous year.
Well, I hope that's right. But I'll wait to see what the numbers are. At some point in the future, we'll know what that means. But certainly, lower immigration should have a positive effect on labor markets. I mean, native and legal workers in the United States. Look, there's some when this question comes up quite often, it's like, well, who wants to go pick lettuce in the Salinas? Well, most people are not going to want to do that. So that's why we have a farm worker program. And as I showed you on one of the slides, of over 200,000 people, or what was the number? I have to go back and look. But anyway, there were a number of people that we admit every year to work on farms. And farmers know, I mean, they're not stupid. They know every year when the harvest season comes. So there's no reason why a farmer, an apple grower can't just go to DHS, X number of months ahead of time and say, hey, and next November, I need 50 workers, and they can get them. I mean, but for at least historically, they have most farmers, most ranchers refused to do that because they didn't have to. They would just go down to the corner and pick up a truckload of illegal aliens who would do the same job. They were already here and wouldn't have to pay them as much.
Okay, another question, would you be able to briefly describe the Canadian system compared to the US system of immigration?
Well, the Canadian system's a point system, and as I said, they have a number of criteria. They give points based on education, language, family, skills, a number of different factors that are used to determine who gets to come. And many other countries have a similar system. The criteria may differ slightly from country to country, but we have no such system.
Okay. Here's one solution to reducing both illegal and legal immigration is to work with our neighbors to make it more attractive to stay there and not try to migrate to the United States. If you want to comment on that, I think our vice president was supposed to go to Central America. They're trying to do it. And I think even the Trump administration was working on trying to improve the economies in some of these other countries.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The question becomes, well, and you're right, during the Trump administration, they went to El Salvador, Guatemala. I don't remember if they went to Honduras or not, but they went to basically the sending countries and tried to negotiate some sort of deal where we would provide some benefits for them. But look at the question is money. I mean, are the taxpayers of the United States going to want to spend billions of dollars to rebuild the economies of the third world countries? And when you add on top of that, many of these countries are corrupt, so the money doesn't end up going to where it's supposed to go. It ends up going to the politicians and the deal makers. So look at if there's a way to improve the economies of all of the Central American countries, go for it. I mean, that's great. And if we only had to worry then, well, and hopefully we also get them to agree to stop allowing third country nationals to transit through their countries to get to the US-Mexican border. I mean, that alone would be a huge benefit. But I don't know if you can see this. This is a book that just came out. It talks about it's just printed this year, so it's like 3 months off the press, and it talks about all of the countries in Central and South America that have become conduits for immigrants trying to get to the United States: Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama. There's a whole number of countries. Ecuador, for a number of years, had no visa requirements, so you could get into Ecuador, and from Ecuador you get, you just transit up to the Mexican-American border and you get through. So if we could get all of the countries in our hemisphere to agree to deal with this problem, we would be much better off. But trying to get all of those countries to agree would have a price tag, and B, who knows what other factors would prevent or prohibit that kind of arrangement.
Yeah, from my FBI time, I was a counterterrorism analyst, and we noticed an uptick in efforts to go through Mexico into the U.S. And in fact, some of the Arabic folks were changing their name to Spanish, and they could easily pass when they wanted to come across the border. And then down in Monterey, there was a big hotbed of sort of radical proselytization going on. And I don't think that's ended, but it's, you know, TSA has done a good job at the airport, somewhat good job with the airlines, but there's still many avenues to get in.
Well, let me go
Um,
back again we talked a little bit, you reminded me, talking about airports. Another failure on the part of the government. For a non-American who's flying into the United States on an airplane or on a ship with a visa, they've got some sort of visa, they're required to fill out a form called an I-94. And that form is collected when the person disembarks and goes through immigration. The idea is that this is a way we can track who came in so that we can tell when they left, if and when they left. The last half of that never happens. The I-94 is turned in, it goes into a file cabinet somewhere, and no one ever checks to see if, you know, so-and-so who came in for 30 days left on the 30 days. So, I mean, the system was set up, it would work, but nobody bothers to use it. Our fault. I mean, you know, these are all self-inflicted wounds. I mean, look at the problems of the world. Some of them are beyond our capacity to deal with. But some parts of the way to deal with it, we can do it, but we don't want to. We do not have the political will to deal with. This isn't rocket science. This is all, everything we've talked about is manageable, but that requires Congress and the president to agree. We've had two, in my professional life, we've had two presidential commissions, one in the late 70s, early 80s. It was called the Hesburgh Commission. That led to the 1986 reform law. And then there was the Barbara Jordan Commission, which led to some reforms in 1996. Both reports came to the same conclusions. Here's how you solve these problems. And Congress sits on their hands because they've been bought off, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have been bought off by special interests that for either political or economic reasons, like the system the way it is.
Okay, I think one thing we will all agree on is that legal immigration has been a big benefit to the United States. I would say nearly all of us have come from somewhere else or have relatives who have. And so it's been good, and we just have to bring it under a certain, like you say, figure out how many we can handle, what we need, and as far as the country goes, because I read some report once that they did a survey and several billion people all wanted to come to the United States. And if they all came, I don't think we would be the United States anymore. And we have a certain carrying capacity with our resources, and we have to consider that. But anyway, Peter, greatly appreciate your presentation. We've reached the end of our time. And thank you so much for coming and being our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you all, and I enjoyed it.